Let's come to a watershed. We have in this presentation 30 of the 52 presentations for the Parayana for 2014. And as 2014 has progressed, it has become evident to everyone in the world what was beginning to be evident some long time ago to those that were concerned. Recently, like yesterday, the net posted an article, NASA-funded study, over 32 advanced civilizations have collapsed before us and we're next in line. And if you read it, it begins classically well enough, limited of course, almost myopic by the scalars that we're working with, but nevertheless accurate enough for a kind of a 1950s style of assessment. And then comes the kicker, as they say in sales pitches. And the kicker is that you can protect yourself with a plan B from the collapse of civilization by having a new investment strategy. Protect your stuff by investing with us. We will take care that you're safe. This, of course, is idiocy. At the current involvement that our planet has with civilization, if it collapses, the planet collapses as well. Life here collapses as well. We had a goad in the 1960s in the anti-war protests. The goad was a saying by Bertrand Russell, Lord Russell, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. His Principia Mathematica with Alfred North Whitehead in 3 big fat volumes from Cambridge was the standard of logic and mathematics together forming the structure by which thinking made sense, was rational. He said, man has never built weapons that he has not used. It is a quibble to say that the use of the atomic bombs in 1945 are a use of the weapons. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were 20,000 tons of TNT. Bikini Atoll was atomized and vaporized out of existence in 1954. And hydrogen superbombs have 50 million tons of TNT. And they are stored by the thousands. So it is not about Plan B. This presentation series is combing back through the history of civilization at the same time as pushing out ahead so that the characterization of that symmetry, that pairedness, is the future and the new past. The future has a spiral dynamic that is not only rooted in the past, which would be an illusion, but is symmetrically concomitant with the new past. Whatever possibilities there are for a future exceed probabilities. And those possibilities of the future are in a continuum with the possibilities of a new past. So that time is the essential synthesizing dimension for civilization as well as for nature, the entire natural cycle, the universe. Is not the fourth dimension, it is the first. It is the dynamic out of which blossoms, which is the best way to talk about it. Yes, it is metaphorical. But without time, space would have no way to speed up and be. It's true that space blossoms instantly, but the instantly needs to occur first. And so the universe has a law of causality, which is time triggered. But time itself is not triggered by time. It's not instantaneous. Space is instantaneous in its three dimensions. But time is spontaneous. And time emerges out of a zero field. We've talked about how ridiculous it is to talk about a 0 point. A 0 point vanishes. And just like the absorption vanishes, the radiation emerges spontaneously, and this can happen x to the nth times per time unit. It happens all the time. So that the universe is really a complex tapestry of absorption and emergence. Countless times per time unit. So that the characterization of the universe is that for the integral cycle to follow a causal line, it must have an integral cast to it that pairs, and pairs in the sense that pairs pair and make squares. And those squares can pair and make triple eights. And one gets a universe that can eventually make sense in that way. But it has a mystery to it, and that concerns how does time occur spontaneously, and where does it go when It not stops, but it vanishes. About 1900 years ago, there was a precocious young black Indian boy born in South India. And he would grow up to be quite an unusual person. And he would be the first person to be able to express adequately why there is a beyond to vanishing, and that the beyond to vanishing has a deep relationship to the spontaneous emergence of the dynamic of time and the instantaneous blossoming of space, and the whole integral cycle has its origin in a paired symmetry of an integral with a differential. It took about 1,500 years after that genius boy in South India, in Andhra Pradesh. Andhra is almost at the point of India. The very point is traditionally called Tamil Nadu. And on the Bay of Bengal side, the east coast of the tip of India, the next section of India is called Andhra Pradesh. It's the Coromandel coast. The big city down where Tamil Nadu begins to mix with Andhra Pradesh is Madras, the beginning of the Coromandel coast. On the other coast, it's called the Malabar coast. Some 1,500 years later, born as a precocious boy in the midsection of England, was Isaac Newton. And almost within just a couple of years, born in what became Germany, a young boy with 3 names, and his last name was Leibniz, G.W.F. Leibniz. Leibniz and Newton at the same time, independently, developed the mathematics by which one can look at the vanishing into zero from oneness, and how from zero one can emerge into oneness, and any degree of development in between 1 and 0, either way, both ways, can be calculated to any specificity of exactness that you care to inquire about, to quest after, to determine. The differential calculus and the integral calculus, both ways, are infinitesimally accurate. And having possession of that for a couple of hundred years led to the beginning of the 20th century, where someone like Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead could have a Principia Mathematica that would show that the way in which logical thought and mathematical proceduring were one and the same. And that one could master, therefore, any degree of specificity infinitesimally, given enough time and given enough development, given enough maturation and refinement, that whatever it is within reach. At the same time that NASA's study showed that 32 civilizations have failed and ours is failing right pronto. An article on the elusive exotic hadron particles confirmed. CERN, on the edge where France and Switzerland meet, in the Large Hadron Collider, LHC, having in 2012, just 2 years ago, used math and experiment to find the Higgs boson, which someone characterized once as condensed vacuum. That it made possible a context of gluedness so that particality would have a relationality with energy, with waves of frequency, so that it would have a permanency. So that the time dynamic of the energy as a wave frequency phenomenally interacting with the integral particality that occurs can build into matter. Now, CERN with the LHC has gone beyond the Higgs boson just 2 years later. Hadrons are subatomic particles made up of quarks and antiquarks. A proton and a neutron are baryons in the sense that they are hadronic in making up of 3 quarks, 2 of one kind and 1 of another, or the neutron is 1 of one kind and 2 of the other. You have this kind of equality. They're all quarks, but there is such a thing as a meson. A meson is made up of a quark and antiquark pair. And so the decay of hadrons are able to become baryon particalities. But the new particles that are now able to be mathematically conceived and experimentally produced are an exotic form where there is a pair of quarks and a pair of antiquarks together. So that you don't have twos in pairs or triplets in quarks. Now you have a pair of pairs of quark and antiquark of this kind of matter that we're acquainted with and that kind of matter that we're acquainted that it isn't very likely around, because when they come together, usually they vanish into energy explosion. Mesons do not. because they carry a very strong dynamic frequency. They're high-powered in that whatever would cancel out, whatever would explode into oblivion, the time dynamic overtones that so that they are able to exist. Because time is the controlling, compositional factor in all of this. The third internet story at the same time, the daily galaxy. The universe may be permeated by an as yet unknown field. Really. The zero field is unknown, but equally unknown because it was never known is the field of consciousness, which is differential, not integral, but can interact with it. And some 1,500 years before Newton and Leibniz, 1,900 years before us, that little boy in South India, that little black Indian boy who was precocious and agile, he could find ways to get into where the pretty girls were, and he became this kind of a young adolescent Don Juan. And one day he got wind of the fact that there was a deep mystery going on here, in that he seemed to be, quote, invisible to those guarding those sweet young things, and that he could move almost as if he was invisible and then be visible to be with them. And he began to wonder what was going on in him, that he had this odd, peculiar capacity. And he was quite intelligent. And he ran across a very large king cobra, in Sanskrit called a naga. This was the Maha Naga, about 30 feet. And he learned through a kind of interspecies telepathy that this was the wisest creature he had ever run across. And that Naga king understood that this was the most unusual of all of those creatures like this, but was scattered because his energy was enormously high, and yet he just used it to scurry around even faster and seemingly then be invisible. And Mahanaga directed him to go to the coast, to the Coromandel coast, to the Bay of Bengal coast, in Andhra Pradesh, where the big Krishna River runs into the Bay of Bengal. It's a huge river. It's about the size of the Columbia River. It's huge, long, immense. And there he ran across wisdom books that he patiently was dedicated to learn to read, and that those wisdom books had been left there by St. Thomas, the apostle who went to India. They were the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the perfection of wisdom sutras. And he was overcome and began to devote himself and found that his enormous field of consciousness was not only fast, it was spontaneous. And he began to understand the language that was being used in ways in which people that normally use language cannot understand. They don't have enough dimensions, because he didn't just move fast, he moved spontaneously. Because he had access, and he's the one that developed what in Sanskrit is called shunyata, the void. Everything that occurs because it exists in its particularity, in its quanta, not just quanta of energy, it's quanta of energy in space. That quanta in and of itself does not carry a signature of existence. And so one has to say it isn't so. He took a big box of these Prajnaparamita Sutras with him up the Krishna River, quite a ways, where there was a very big bend in the Krishna River. It's like the Columbia River has a great big bend where the Snake River comes in its mysterious dark current, and the carving of the Columbia coming down and the Snake coming straighten out and make the big Columbia River that goes into the Pacific Ocean. But the Columbia had to be turned by the Snake River, which is a wild river. It carves canyons 2 miles deep. It pushes something like the Columbia River, like the firing of a spinning capsule like Gemini 8, which docked with the Agena with Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott in it, and they began to have a left roll, and they thought it was because the Agena was working on them, and so they undocked. It was the first docking ever done in space. And so they undocked, which was the first undocking done, and the roll increased, and finally Neil Armstrong did something that only a really superior jet pilot does. He turned on the thrusters, and the thrusters evened out the roll, and Gemini 8 was going to be able to land. And he said to Dave Scott, on Dave Scott's reportage, he said, "Neil said to me, it looks like we're going to live to have another adventure." Nagarjuna, where the Krishna River does a big bend, saw that there was an enormous ridge rock that later would be called the Hill of Nagarjuna in the Telugu language of ancient Dravidian Andhra Pradesh. It's called Konda, Nagarjuna Konda. It's about 75 miles to the southeast from a very large city, Hyderabad, which was the ancient Maharaja center for that whole swath of territory, not only in South India, but on into central India, all the way up into the more northern provinces like Maharashtra. And at the time of Nagarjuna, the Satyavana kings, the great king of that whole area, made a royal behest to Nagarjuna that he would be able to develop whatever he wanted to develop there, because among other things, Nagarjuna had mastered medicine and architecture. He was a black Indian who was a masterful architect and a master of medicine, like a black Egyptian named Imhotep, who was the developer of the pyramids under Zoser, and also was Zoser's personal physician. There's a way in which India and Egypt have a tremendous shared interpenetration in civilization, in case you didn't know. The way in which this is edited by Pratapapada Diksha Pal, P-A-L. He was here in Los Angeles. He's the one that organized the Oriental Asian collections of the Los Angeles Museum on Wilshire Boulevard, and the author of maybe 25 or 30 great books on Indian art and architecture. The meeting place of Egyptian civilization coming south and Indian civilization coming west was Ethiopia. Much bigger than our Ethiopia, because at that time that they met was about 2000 BC beginning. And over a course of time, by about 1500 BC, by the time of Hatshepsut, as the woman pharaoh in Egypt, the shipping had become an art where Hatshepsut would send 60 ships at a time in the special conditions before a monsoon season, and they would go from the island of Socotra, off the coast of the empire was always South Yemen and Ethiopia. Its ancient name was Sheba. At that time, even 1500 BC, 500 years later, it would have a queen of their own named Makeda, the Queen of Sheba. And 500 years before then, which is why she was so wealthy 500 years later, there was this immense trade between India and Egypt. And so the Ethiopians became this interesting kind of interpenetration of populations. And that the Ethiopians themselves have a very distinctive quality to them, which is why 500 years later Solomon was so taken with the Queen of Sheba, because she was enormously literate on a scale that was almost impossible, because King David, who was a great writer, the Psalms of David, and Solomon, with that heritage, also a great writer, the Proverbs, found in the Queen of Sheba someone who had more facility with language than he could have ever known before. Because there is a quality to the black peoples of humanity of understanding the almost infinite filigree of language. In India, it's true. No one could use language more refined than Nagarjuna. Even today, he's like a wonder. Almost all of the really high learning in Tibetan Buddhism is Nagarjuna resonances. We live in a world where the great swath of black humanity is not only in North America and the Caribbean and Africa and in India, but has extended for 50,000 years into the Pacific Islands, all the way to Australia. And someone did a survey about a generation or so ago on the great island of New Guinea. They were doing an inquiry on Melanesian languages and why it was that so many different valleys have totally different languages in New Guinea. And they found that there are 1,371 different languages on New Guinea. They have more language diversity than the rest of the world put together. No one has interrupted them. They have been free to develop incredible facility with subtleties and scalars of language, of intonation, of pitch, and so forth. That is mind-boggling. The first man to do studies on that was named Codrington. His book from 100-some years ago is still reprinted by Dover paperbacks. Codrington. One of the great anthropologists, Bronislaw Malinowski, was studying that little strait in between New Guinea and the other larger islands like New Britain and New Ireland and the Solomons and so forth, the Torres Strait, Torres. And he was studying to see how these people in the Trobriand island complex lived when war broke out, World War II, and Malinowski was stranded. He couldn't leave. So he lived with the Trobriand Islanders for about 4 or 5 years, and he learned that they're extremely wise. They have a very limited diet, but they found that there was a central synthesizing vegetable, yams, which was susceptible to be used like languages in very special ways. It's like the Irish with potatoes or the Chinese with rice, Americans with wheat. They could utilize yams in many special ways, and they had a whole way of utilizing other kinds of potential food substances. And so the yam gardens were guarded by a special quality of consciousness, which the West calls magic. Malinowski said, well, these are magical gardens, which the Melanesians, the Trobriand Islands, utilized so that they can live. And they live pretty well. And so he wrote that up, 2 classic volumes. I'll bring them in next week. It's the way in which it was a wake-up call about the same time that other studies were being done, that one has to pay attention to the incredible scalar variations of human kind. They all have their own genius. And when we come back from the break, we'll see that this third The universe seems to be permeated by a special field, and they didn't know what to call it, so they took Aristotle's name for it, quintessence. Well, Aristotle didn't really make a big thing out of quintessence. It was in the medieval usage of Aristotle, and it came from Arabic science, and quintessence refers to alchemy. And the Arabs learned alchemy from someone in Jerusalem around 650 AD. Yazid learned it from a Christian monk who had studied the Egyptian Semitic origins of alchemy and had refined it, and Moranius is the one who taught the Arabs alchemy because he utilized a Christian refinement of an ancient Semitic, Egyptian, Greek way of doing things, and they carried this through ostensibly under Aristotle, and that's where the people who only have a little bit of education, call it quintessence, and we'll come back exactly to that. Let's take a break.